But places also matter because they control in some ways the access that you've got. Whatever attributes you have yourself, if you can't get access to social infrastructure, if you can't get access to adequate transport, if you can't get access to adequate childcare, you may find yourself locked in particular segments of the labour market. And it does matter what your address is when you contemplate those segments. And a person that knew that very well was Gough Whitlam, whose name, of course, is in the Whitlam Centre. I remember Whitlam saying that in his policy speech in 1972 before he was elected to the Government of Australia. Place does matter. Okay, I want to move on fairly quickly to the question of jobs regionalising. Now, it is a case that by about 1990, about 70%, maybe two-thirds, a little bit more of people in Western Sydney could get access to jobs in Western Sydney. And we started to understand that suburbanisation of jobs was getting rid of the notion that suburbs were just dormitories with people moving out. All kinds of economic activity was relocating to suburban areas. But that two-thirds figure was achieved more than a decade ago. And the interesting thing is, despite that decade of economic growth, that regionalisation seems to have stalled. Still two-thirds, or actually possibly slightly less at the 2006 census. So what's happening is that the net job creation is only just keeping up with the growth of the labour force. In outer suburban Sydney, one of the fastest growing population areas among the cities of Australia. So in the end, it's not to me about whether jobs are growing or not. For people's job experiences, it's about whether they can get access to those jobs. And I remember always using the example of Auburn, one of the local government areas on the inner western part of Greater Western Sydney. And Auburn still has one of the highest unemployment rates in the city. But Auburn is surrounded by job growth. Some of that job growth is in the local government area of Auburn, and much of it is in those very jazzy finance business service activities because of the location of Auburn in relation to the whole city. What's happening is that the people, resident workers in that place, are watching those jobs grow, but many of them don't have access to those jobs because of the other things that segment labour markets, and particularly access to social infrastructure. So very quickly, unemployment in Western Sydney, here's a stark illustration. In 1996, about 8 of the 14 local government areas in Greater Western Sydney had unemployment rates above the national average, well above the Sydney average. 2001 was about the same. 2006, it was the same. Maybe there was a decade of lost opportunities in not just growing the cake, but changing the distribution of it, really building up some of the platforms on which extra employment can grow in a fast-growing area, changing the structure of those jobs away from the production sectors. Western Sydney is one of the most important production sectors in Australia, towards those finance business service activities, which these days give career paths for lots of people that the productive sectors have ceased to do. So Western Sydney in 2006 had the highest and lowest rates of unemployment in the city. Yes, yes. No yes and no here. So I want to illustrate that with a couple of graphs. The first one shows that coming out of the previous restructuring, on the left-hand side of that diagram, you had lots of volatility, lots of difference between the highest unemployment rate places and the lowest unemployment places in Western Sydney. But by the time the economy had restructured itself into what we could call a boom, the volatility had shrunk a little. The gap had closed. There's a tighter distribution of those places. We haven't removed the differences, but the differences are in a tighter band by the late 1990s. And so it is now, but we're moving into the situation where what's likely to happen, and Raja has indicated this for general national figures, we've got a tighter structure of unemployment differences between the best and the worst. But what happens in recessions is the volatility opens up again. So unless we've restructured those places specifically in relation to access to those jobs, then my prediction is, unfortunately, those differences between the highest and lowest are probably going to open out in outer suburban Sydney as well. So who really feels the impact of that? The best way I can illustrate this, then I just want to quickly talk about food security, is to show you a map of Blacktown right down to collector district levels from census data. Now, Blacktown comes out at the local government area as having an above average unemployment rate. But you can see when you look at that map that really a place like Blacktown with over 200,000 people, it's a complicated landscape in its own right. Perhaps a majority of those collector districts share the condition of national unemployment rate. In fact, many of those collector districts in Blacktown had lower than average unemployment rates. Let's say the average was 5%, which it probably was when that map was drawn up from the census. Virtually none of those localities are experiencing 5%. Many of them have a lower unemployment rate than 5%, but a small cluster of them, shown there in the darkest red, have unemployment rates of 3, 4 to 5 times the national average. So the high unemployment rate figure is being driven by a small cluster of places with specific characteristics and specific problems of access to the jobs that are actually growing, sometimes in their own backyards. And I have to say that a map I drew of this in 1991, again in 1996, again in 2001, and again in 2006, it was substantially the same map. I'm not saying that those problems then are intractable, I'm saying that they've been overlooked and something needs to be done to our overall strategies of access to employment to recognise that there are vulnerable places as well as vulnerable people in a city that overall is going ahead. Food security I'll finish with because it's an underestimated and underrated problem which will be exacerbated by this recession. And a higher proportion of people than one would expect in a city like Sydney, in a rich country like Australia, in a big net exporter of food, a higher proportion of people you would expect actually are experiencing food insecurity. And Clare gave us a very good example of Bill. Just working it out, you know, $20 a week for food. That would be 4 sandwiches in Macquarie's canteen at the moment. So we know that that puts people on a knife edge, and indeed the Red Cross, who Phil said I'm working with the Red Cross at the moment on this problem in urban areas, some of those statistics tend to show that maybe overall 5% of households are affected by food insecurity. That's if you run out of food in the middle of the week, you're not sure when the next meal is going to come. But just like that unemployment statistic, and I must say we do not have the information yet about this, which is why we're working with Red Cross, but just like that unemployment map that I showed you, I've got no doubt that that 5% figure means very little. What we have are some places and some people who are extremely vulnerable to food insecurity, and during a recession they cop it the worst. And a very preliminary study that Anglicare have done tend to suggest that in parts of southwestern Sydney, maybe 20% of households are facing food insecurity in 2008. And that was before the recession hit.